questionable coaching decisions, bad challenges, questionable refereeing, lots of real football stuff to discuss from the conference championship games, and that's what we'll be talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. I'm a newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, we were looking forward to an incredible day of football. We talked about how this could. I was so excited last week for anyone who was listening to the shows. I was, having dreams about the games, waking up on Thursday, thought it was Sunday, thought the games were on Thursday. I was like, yeah, games are today. And I was like, oh, wait, no, I got to wait 3 more days. I did that pretty much the whole weekend. I woke up Saturday. I thought it was Sunday. I was like a little kid in the candy store for these 2 games. First one, not super exciting, but still a lot we can discuss. There was a ton that went on in that Eagles and Niners game. There was some questionable ref decisions. There was a really interesting discussion to be had, or interesting for us who are football nerds, about the third QB rule that used to exist and doesn't exist anymore, and why doesn't it exist for these exact situations. The second game answered the bell. We got an incredible game down to the end, but just, a lot that went on in that game. And for me, one of the big headlines was, look, we talked about it last week. I was driving home how maddening it was for me that the narrative was, oh, Burrow's better than Mahomes, when the Bengals had beaten the Chiefs 3 times by 3 points each time. But in each game, I felt like, maybe not in each game, but certainly at times, the Chiefs had outplayed the Bengals in those games, but they did a really poor job of maximizing basically their win probability, their potential of winning the game in those games. We talked through a lot of it, key turnovers, etc. And the Bengals did a much better job, and Burrow's very good in fourth quarter situations. We talked about that. They were able to put themselves in positions to win and maximize their chances to win relative to how well they were playing, which at times was worse than KC, but they're still able to get these wins by 3 points. But that's why I thought it was so maddening that people were saying, oh, Joe Burrow is Patrick Mahomes' daddy or whatever. We talked about this a lot on the show last week. The Chiefs, in some respects, they get a little bit of payback by winning by 3 in a game that could have went either way. And that's another huge point we talked about last week, right? It's these 1-score games. We talk about it with the Pythagorean wins and everything all offseason every year. 1-score games, a lot of variance in those. Chiefs win a game with a lot of variance and a lot of stuff that we can talk about the rest. We can talk about a lot of things. That's just how football is sometimes in 1-score games. But prior to that, it looked a lot like their past losses to the Bengals, where the Chiefs were outplaying Cincinnati for most of the first half. You can talk about into the third quarter, that Mahomes fumble being a massive play, which we broke down their past matchup in the regular season last week. Travis Kelce has a fumble a minute into the fourth quarter with the Chiefs driving and up 4. Bengals come down and score a TD in return, where the Chiefs could have potentially pushed it to 2 scores or at least a field goal to make it 7. They fumble in the first minute of the fourth quarter. Bengals TD, whole new game. And that was their first matchup of the regular season. In this matchup, Chiefs up 7 this time and driving 1 minute left in the third. So same spot in the game, that turn from the third to the fourth quarter. Mahomes just lets the ball slip out of his hands. He fumbles. Bengals go down and score a quick touchdown. They tie it in this one, and the other one they had taken the lead. But same massive switch where the Chiefs in the second half have the chance to be pulling away, ball in hand with a lead, and they have a fumble from one of their best players. So much symmetry there. The Chiefs still wind up pulling this game off, Shawn, but just a really horrible job throughout the game of maximizing their win probability. I know you as a Chiefs fan, you're excited that they actually won. But Andy Reid especially, and we're going to talk about a lot of different things on the show, but one of the big headlines for me is Andy Reid had a terrible, terrible game.
He did. And I know that you had tweeted that he hasn't self-scouted and improved on these things. I think that he has. But just because you improve on something doesn't mean... you can go from terrible to bad. And especially when you're still bad, you can have a poor game within your new range of how good you are at something, which is what he did. This was a strange game because I do felt like Joe Burrow made some incredible throws. And I was telling you that I thought Joe Burrow was better than Josh Allen. I thought that was a pretty controversial take. There's no question that Patrick Mahomes is still well ahead of both of these guys. But Joe Burrow made a lot of great plays in this game, and yet the Chiefs defense answered the bell so definitively. This is probably the best game that the Chiefs defense has had since Marty Schottenheimer was the head coach, and they were more like the 49ers of today, for example. For Kansas City's defense to play the way they played in this game and to create so many different situations where the Chiefs could have more or less ended the game right there. And for the Chiefs, both through Mahomes having some hiccups and then coaching decisions, I mean, if they had lost this game, the defense is just going to feel like one of the greatest games they've ever played has been thrown away. So, I mean, fortunately, again, if you're rooting for the Chiefs, that didn't happen. If you're rooting for the Bengals, then you probably have a handful of grievances that you want to air out about certain things that happened.
Yeah, but huge bummer for Bengals fans who, I mean, they're a fun team. They're a young team. They are a fan base that is, both of these fan bases. You Chiefs have had a lot of your fair share of playoff losses, but at least you've gotten over the hump and gotten one Super Bowl under your belt. Bengals, obviously, a long time of suffering. Feel terrible for Bengals fans the way this game ended. At the same time, like, just from a human perspective, I'm really glad they didn't end up winning this again the way that everything you're describing, because if they would have came out with this game in a 3-point game again, I mean, the narratives, Sean, about how Burrow is just better than Mahomes, it would have been too much for me to handle.
Well, it would have been tough too. I mean, because you see all the stats being flashed up on the screen about where Travis Kelce ranks all-time postseason. You see some of the comparisons between Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes in AFC Championship games that make it very clear that, at least again until this game, where the Chiefs defense comes to play in a magical fashion, you can see that Patrick Mahomes is the thing driving the Chiefs in these AFC Championship games, whereas Tom Brady was a little bit more, and obviously Tom Brady enthusiasts are going to dispute this and not care for it, but a little bit more of a caretaker of a Patriots franchise that is just so gloriously dominant in a lot of different ways. Not to say Tom Brady played poorly in AFC Championship games, because he obviously dominated. But for Patrick Mahomes to have done those things and not be recognized for them, that I think would be unfortunate. We're just in this... there are so many things about this year that we didn't care for from a fan perspective, because the football got very boring at times. And yet we're also in a golden age where you have these three incredible franchises in the AFC. They come through this, and despite being in this golden age in the AFC, I mean, the Chiefs are going to have to pull a rabbit out of the hat to win the Super Bowl. I mean, this is very similar to 2 years ago, where they were the best team in the NFL, and they go to the Super Bowl, and they get hammered. And that I thought was a little bit fluky. This time, unless they can get some people healthy, they could get routed in the Super Bowl, having come through an AFC that also features the Bengals and the Bills. I mean, that would be unfortunate kind of for AFC fans and Chiefs fans, but I think it does, again, just point us in the direction of how cool so many of the teams are right now. This Philadelphia Eagles team, fantastic. In some ways, it's unfortunate for them that they get robbed of being able to show their brilliance simply because that game is ruined by quarterback injuries and becomes in a pretty bad game. I mean, Jalen Hurts played extremely poorly, and he didn't get a second half to kind of rectify that and, even work out some of the nerves before the Super Bowl, because they didn't need to throw the ball anymore.
They didn't have to do anything.
I mean, you're robbed of all of that. But
before we pivot to that game too much, first of all, I will note for the listeners who I'm sure are very aware of this, because I've made a point of emphasizing it at all stages. You, I believe, maybe weren't predicting the Jaguars to upset the Chiefs, but certainly thought that was possible. Mahomes gets a high ankle sprain, can barely move, and they still win comfortably.
I said it could come down to the end, and why do they have like a third string special teamer making the big play at the end? The Jaguars could have scored there. They give a stop and a score, and you lose.
You said that the Bengals, I believe you said to me maybe off the air, that the Bengals should have been favored by a touchdown in this game. Mahomes, again, doesn't have the mobility necessarily. The Chiefs do a pretty terrible job of maximizing their win probabilities. We talked about pretty terrible job with a lot of things. Some really bad punt decisions, terrible work with their timeouts. I want to go through all the Andy Reid things, because I love Andy Reid. He is such a fun coach. I hope he never retires. But my God, you said he's gone from terrible to bad. This was one of the worst managed head coaching games I've ever seen in the NFL. I don't know how you can say he's better than this. Has got to be the worst game he's ever had. I don't remember all the specifics of all the games. He had some bad games in Philly. I remember. I mean, this is the narrative around Andy Reid. This has got to be the worst game. 2 challenges that were complete, and he ends up winning one, but were completely like baffling. He's out of timeouts in the first half with 4 minutes left. The punt with 2 minutes left in the half, and the punt with 2 minutes left in the game. Both just insane punts when you have Patrick Mahomes.
There's 10 years from now, the discussion between whether Andy Reid or Bill Belichick is the greatest NFL coach of all time is going to tilt to Andy Reid.
Okay,
so we're just going to throw that out there.
There are other things
that
go into
some
coaching.
Of his weaknesses.
And Andy Reid is fantastic. There's the Twitter bot, the surrender index for punts. I don't know what goes into their model, but they have this surrender index, and then they tweet out when teams punt. Their tweet was when Kansas City decided to punt to Cincinnati from the Cincinnati 37 on 4th and 8 with 2:36 remaining in the fourth while tied 20-20. Again, 2:36, just enough time for the team to move down and kick a game-winning field goal. 4th and 8 from the 37, the plus 37. You're inside the 40-yard line. You're in field goal range for Harrison Butker. This had a surrender index of whatever, 120.85, which is their model. It ranked in the 99.9th percentile of cowardly punts of the 2022 season. It also ranked in the 99.9th percentile of all punts since 1999. It was the cowardliest punt of all time. And you have Patrick Mahomes. That's of all punts, of all teams with all quarterbacks. You go for it when you have Patrick Mahomes, even if it's not, obvious.
Bert, are you taking into account that Townsend was on fire?
He did manage to get the coffin corner, because the only thing worse would have been if he kicks that into the end zone and they get a touchback and you only net 17 yards. That would have been insane. He did put them inside the 10. But the horrible thing about that is he also did the same in the first half with 2 minutes left. And the Bengals traveled right down the field, got down to the 5-yard line in time to run 2 plays and goal. They did end up having to settle for a field goal on 3rd and goal. So they were ultimately, because you punted and pinned them back, one of the arguments could have been, well, now the Bengals have to go further and they won't have enough time to travel the whole length of the field. You can argue that they lost 1 play off their drive. They could have, on a normal drive, been able to run that 3rd and goal play from the 5, had one more chance at a TD before they had to settle for the field goal. Otherwise, the punt yardage did absolutely nothing to their drive before the end of the half.
Oh, so you're saying there was a recent example of how that's not a very strong play tactic?
Yes, there was literally a half earlier, an example of, with 2 minutes left in the half, it was also an insane decision. They punted from the 39, and if you convert there, you potentially have the last drive of the half. That's one of the big advantages, is you want the last drive of the half at all times, because there's no carryover. It doesn't change who gets the ball first in the second half. You want so going for it inside the other team's 40 in that spot makes a ton of sense. And instead they punted. Bengals get the last drive. They get the last points. It ends up being a pretty huge, moment in terms of why this game stayed close late, because the Chiefs could have put them away in the first half. Sean, we were talking about this before the show. But I mean, all of these decisions, Andy Reid, rough game for him.
All of those things are true. I think that it does illustrate the craziness of how this game had developed, and the fact that when you're in that moment at the end, that this game had flipped from what we saw last year with Chiefs Bills, for example, and how the last team with the ball was going to win, and possession would have mattered at all costs, and rules are changed to make sure that possessions are matched in playoff games, to a point here where, this was a defensive slugfest. The Chiefs had no confidence that they could move the ball at this point in the game, and they were more or less counting on a miracle that their defense would come through and get something done, because their offense was done. And that's an unfortunate place to be in, but I really do think that that's the calculus that they were undergoing. They didn't feel like they had any plays that would work at that point in the game.
You can't at any point in any game not feel like you have any plays that work, or else you just lose. But I have a hard time with that statement.
The thing that happens here in this game, right? And something little that happened before the game even started that I had to go back and catch up on today because I was trying to figure it out as the game was taking place. But as you're doing that, you don't want to look something up and find out any spoilers or just you're so in the moment. But Justin Watson was inactive for this game, I guess because of an illness. Yes. And he's someone who has made some big plays for Kansas City down the field, is a bigger bodied receiver with speed, and someone who they don't throw to him a lot, but he is a difference maker on a shot types of plays for the Chiefs.
And this is the game where they would have used him. With the other injuries they had, he's run a ton of routes. They have used him. He's been something of, an anchor for them, especially the second half of the season in their wide receiver rotation, where he runs a good amount of routes. He's been kind of like the Demarcus Robinson of past seasons. We'll go back to the Chris Conley or whatever. He's playing a ton, not getting a lot of targets, like you said. But as soon as Tony gets hurt, Mecole Hardman gets hurt, they get down to what was it? Marcus Kemp they were using late, and he was like sort of their last guy on their roster. He'd played 10 snaps all season. When they're running him out there, they would have been relying on Watson. I'm totally with you. He would have had a good game.
And Watson is better than Conley and Demarcus Robinson.
Yes.
I mean, similar athlete maybe to Conley, but with hands. And Demarcus Robinson, not even athletic. So when you lose those guys and don't have the fourth player, this is a game where Sky Moore has 7 targets and gains 13 yards. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong for the Chiefs at the receiver position. All of the sort of worst case scenarios that could hit these guys hit them. When you think about Kadarius Toney, and the Giants are sitting around laughing at this trade because Toney demonstrated exactly why they didn't want it. He goes up and he elevates and makes a play on the ball early in this game. It's very impressive. But then once all the hard part is done, and I say all the hard part, coming down and rolling over the ball on the ball is the other hard part. But once you caught it, you can't drop that pass, right? And then he goes out after making kind of a nice play with a ticky-tack kind of injury. There's no way that Kadarius Toney is ever going to play serious snaps for you. So you can't even think like we're going to develop the young guys next year, because you develop him and then he just can't play in the games. Juju Smith-Schuster with the knee problem. Mecole Hardman, they were desperate to get back. He makes a nice play, gets knocked out. The Chiefs wide receiving core was weak going into the game. That was one of our main points. But then all of those guys are knocked out. If they don't get like the dream game that they had been hoping for from Marquez Valdez-Scantling, do they gain any yards?
They're done, yeah. And you're right. That's the way that MVS played or came through or was needed to be relied on, however you want to view that. Great game from him. He did a lot of things that he hasn't done all year, and I didn't really expect from him. He even had like a wide receiver screen. He showed some yak ability, which has never been his
play.
Yeah, it was a huge play, but I was like, I tweeted as a joke, like, MVS is a yak god now? Like, what's happening? Like, he played a great game, but his involvement is a total point in favor of what you were saying about how Justin Watson was. That was crucial, underratedly crucial thing. But
I was talking about Kelce supposedly legitimately a game time decision. You have, Jarrett McKinnon gives you nothing in this game. The bizarre thing here is that Isaiah Pacheco again demonstrated that he cannot be your running back. The normal running plays from him were apocalyptic in terms of like how bad his vision and initial contact ability to handle is. But he took some screens and generated some incredible yards after contact in those plays. Once he gets going, there was kind of a funny play in this sequence that you and I both really want to talk about, where it appeared that Patrick Mahomes was trying to teach him how to catch passes after he threw a pass to him that he didn't reel in. You don't see that too often in games where
that has to be the end of the first half sequence that you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah.
So that we talked a little bit about before the show, but this was the first punt I just referenced. The Bengals get the ball with about 4 minutes left. Again, the Chiefs are already completely out of timeouts in the first half because Andy Reid thinks timeouts are, I don't know.
But Ben, it's so in his defense, one of the things that I don't like is, especially in the first half. Now, the timeouts matter in football in both cases because you're trying to maximize possessions. You have so few of them. And if you give your timeouts away, even in the first half, you may lose a full possession, which could be the thing that causes you the game. But if you're in a huge leverage play And in part because of injuries and in part because of the uniqueness of the play and the importance of the game, you need to take a moment and discuss what you're going to do. And then you dial up the perfect play and execute it for a touchdown.
You can do
That
that
should
once.
put you in position to win the game. I mean, that should have been the pivotal moment in the entire game. Even though there's a lot to play, it gives you such a huge edge. So they call the timeout. They have the 4th and 1. They run the play into the end zone instead of just trying to get the first down. They score the touchdown. I like making sure that you're ready to run that play appropriately. That doesn't excuse all the rest of the problems.
Right. You can do that once, and especially in the first half, I will accept that's acceptable. That's okay. I think it's harder to do when it's your 3rd timeout, but the fact that they executed it again, I will grant you that it's okay. Even though that touchdown, Sean, I'm disagreeing that it was a perfect play call. They rolled Mahomes out. They moved the line. That was part of the play call. The rest of it was Travis Kelce was going to run a corner route. They broke this down in the broadcast. Going to run a corner route. He ends up breaking back the other way. Romo saying, I think he has a lot of flexibility here to do whatever he wants. The rest of the play was just Patrick Mahomes you've rolled him out and you're letting him read the field. And Travis Kelce has the flexibility to do whatever he wants on the route. And it's 2 superstars making a play. I don't think it was the perfect play call. I think it was 2 great players making a great play. Still.
But, I mean, you call the play where you're like, the 2
yes.
superstars can win this.
Yes.
I like that.
I agree with that.
On your best guys.
I do agree with that, and I'm okay with that timeout. Having said that, the earlier timeout, I'm looking at the game log right now, came on, Sean, 3rd and goal from the 19. They came out of the timeout and had a 13-yard completion and then kicked a shorter field goal. The first timeout came on a really early challenge on a play where your receiver in no way believes that he caught the pass. He gets up, he's angry. He doesn't, this is a Tony play you just described, doesn't show any indication whatsoever that he thinks he caught the pass. The first couple replays don't really make it clear, and it was a high leverage 3rd down play. I would argue the first replay did show the ball going to the ground. I thought I saw it hitting the ground, and I'm watching for that because I also saw that Tony didn't believe he caught it. So my thought was, oh, that's where he dropped it. Somebody in the Kansas City's booth says down to Reed, we don't have a good look on this. It's too big of a play, whatever. They decide to challenge. I have a really hard time with it as well because you have the ball, and so you can run the play clock down yourself a little bit. You can get ready for the field goal, but I think your team should know that they can run the play clock all the way down there, give yourself some time. They maybe kind of did that. Ultimately, they throw a challenge flag. I thought they threw it kind of quick. I can't remember exactly, but just no scenario where that was an acceptable challenge that early in the game because your receiver.
So this is kind of interesting for me, where I mean, this is probably wrong and probably just kind of trying to craft too much of a narrative or what have you. But I think when you're that close, you have to celebrate like you caught it.
Yeah.
Because the officials actually did not know. They didn't know. And they took the celebration from the Bengals guys and the frustration from Tony as the key to making the call on the field. If you celebrate, they were going to give him a touchdown.
Yeah.
Right. And then you force the officials to overturn it, which would have been a little bit of a challenge because, that ball rolls on the ground, but his hand is on it the whole time. And so you force them to say, okay, it moved too much. And we're not going to give you credit for having control even as it's moving and it's on the ground, which they probably do overturn, but it would have been tight. And you have to celebrate there.
If he gets up and celebrates, they might rule it a catch, and the Bengals might have had the same issue that the Niners had in the first game, where Devonta Smith's catch also was probably not a catch, and Devonta Smith got up and was like, "Hey, we got to hurry to the line."
So that one was one where maybe I just went through it too quickly. I thought it was the catch, and I thought one of the things that I always want the teams to.
I knew you were going to say that because you're such an optimist and you're such a Devonta Smith fan. There's no way you didn't think that was a catch, but it was not a catch.
It looked like on one of the best catches I've ever seen. It was a great catch myself, but you've got to get up. So do you think do you know, Ben, are the teams coached to do this where if you make a great play and it's a high leverage play, that you're instantly then running up to the line of scrimmage and encouraging your team to run a play quickly in order to generate the false challenge from the opponent? Because I thought they were trying to get a false challenge flag thrown out to waste one of the 49ers timeouts and challenges, because the missed challenge from the Chiefs early in the game, it cost them a timeout, but it cost them a challenge. We're also going to talk about the second challenge, which we thought was probably one of the things about getting that play called a touchdown for Kadarius Toney in the first place is you just never know what the officials are actually going to rule on something. Because I think that everyone was mind boggled that they overturned the play that the Chiefs challenged with their second challenge, where you had the ball extended and then brought back. No one thought that was going to be overturned in the Chiefs' favor. So you don't know what's going to happen on these official rulings, even when they're looking at multiple angles of them.
But you still have to make good decisions, even if the refs are unreliable. The MVS one, the way the rule is, and this has come up in, and I tweeted about this a little bit during the game, but so if you were following me on Twitter, maybe you saw it. But the way it's come up during the season is on some like fourth and ones or third and ones where they do the QB sneaks. We've seen the QB do the like over the top, over the pile, stretch the ball out like he's getting across, which they do at the goal line. And at the goal line, as soon as the ball breaks the plane with it in the player's possession, it's a touchdown. Play's over. We're done. In the field of play, it's a different rule. With the line with the yard to gain mark, I was going to say the line of scrimmage, whatever. How far they need to get where the sticks are. If the player extends it across and then voluntarily extends it back, it's just the same as any other forward progress related rule, where if the player himself voluntarily moves backward on the field, you don't get forward progress. You don't get a run back 20 yards and then say, oh, well, I was way up there. And it's the same exact thing. If the player stretches the ball out, and we were talking about this before the show, Sean, I still don't really understand what happened there. You said to me that it seemed like they ruled for progress at the point that he was extended, like he was getting pulled back too. And so I can kind of see this argument where, like, while he was extended before he voluntarily, with his arm, pulled the ball back, maybe his body was involuntarily being pulled back. And so there is a forward progress argument that he was being pulled back while extended and then pulled the ball back. I think he was trying to do the thing I just described. The team players do at the goal line all the time, where they try to stretch the ball over the goal line and then bring it back to themselves. Regardless, they overturned that, and I'm so confused by it, and it sounds like you are as well.
Yeah, well, as I was watching the play and what the Chiefs did, I'm thinking, well, the Chiefs don't understand the rules, and they just threw away their second challenge.
Yeah.
So now they've lost another timeout, and they're out of challenges, which they were out of challenges either way, which is why you can't miss that first challenge if it was clearly not going to work for you. But this gives you a sense of why the teams do challenge things, just that they want to be different, because every once in a while, somehow magically they are different. It seemed to be something where the only possible explanation was that the Bengals got like incredibly unlucky in that exactly as he's full stretch, that his body is pulled back, and that the officials decided that is the point where the play is dead, which is a little bit weird because we even saw like a pretty flagrant hit in Eagles 49ers game on, I believe, McCaffrey, but on someone where a defensive guy comes flying out of nowhere and wipes out a player who has been stopped for a while, simply because the officials refuse to blow the whistle.
Right.
I don't understand what's happening in these
That
games.
was McCaffrey. I remember that play. And then they showed a replay and they're like, oh, he gets hit really hard here. And they didn't show the second hit that was like late. The replay didn't even extend long enough to show it. I was like, that's not the one where he got up slow. It's the one that came in, 2 seconds later. But yeah, no, I remember exactly the play you're talking about.
So for the Bengals to lose this call because of like an instantaneous sort of, that was forward progress at that point, that seems pretty unlikely. It's possible we just still don't understand the rules because they've been explained in multiple ways by the officiating experts who, we know have worked in the field and are very up to date on what they're doing. It's not that they can't make mistakes, but that one is a head scratcher. And you do kind of feel for Zach Taylor, the Bengals fan base, the Bengals players, everyone on this. I had mentioned on OT that I thought that most of the questionable calls were more or less correct, and the Chiefs hadn't necessarily gotten too many things in their favor that I would say were sketchy, because I'm thinking of the pass interference when the Chiefs get the extra play. And I love Gene Steratore. That was like the textbook definition of pass interference. So I don't know why he was saying that he wouldn't have called that.
The MVS one.
Right.
The hook and turn. Yeah, that was the booth was saying that's not a big enough hook and turn. To that point, the Bengals had gotten some unfair calls against them. And to me, it felt like the booth was a little bit like, almost leaning into a conspiracy theory or something. Like they were like, oh, there's another one that's questionable. Like, no, that is called a pass interference every time. It's ticky tack, but it's called every time. You cannot grab and hook the backside. It is exactly why MVS was not able to extend. He was getting turned. He's small and not a large receiver. He's easily turned. But like there was the backside grab and hook that we see called every single time during the season. I was with you. I was like, what? Why are they calling that ticky tack? They're constantly saying that's called the way that it's supposed to be called when it looks just like that.
I mean, that would be like in an NFL officiating video where like, you've got to call this because he turns him and contacts too early and he can't extend. So we agree on that. It's not that we're right, but we did see that one the same way. The play at the end, obviously called correctly. The one that was a little bit weird, I think is weird in part because the officials normally don't call it, but the intentional grounding, which did play a huge role because, I mean, the Bengals we saw at the end of the first half pick up a 3rd and 16 where really it's like the only play in the whole game where the Chiefs seem to really blow a coverage because the long touchdown to T. Higgins was pretty well covered, an amazing throw, a great catch. The 4th and 6, 30-plus yard gain by Jamar Chase, that's an unbelievable throw and catch into double coverage where the guys are there.
Yeah, but I mean, really poor play on the ball from both DBs.
Yeah, they did lose track of this. But that's one where if that's not 4th and 6, you don't throw that ball. One of the things I'm thinking about this game is that Burrow probably needs to challenge double coverage to Jamar Chase more often because you're going to get some of those types of plays. And one of the things that happened, especially after Tyler Boyd goes out in this game, you're getting double coverage on T. Higgins and Jamar Chase on almost all of these plays, and the Chiefs executed. Again, it was a dream performance from their defense. Then Andy Reid gets bailed out of that punt decision as well, and maybe the Chiefs even get their own field goal or touchdown at the end of the first half, which again, a play that would have more or less ended the game, but the Chiefs do have the breakdown.
You're talking about the DPI where Burrow kind of threw it up in the middle of the field and the DB got there a little early and hit Hurst.
That was the other big breakdown. That's not the one I'm thinking of. That would have also ended the game more or less. I'm thinking of the 3rd and 16 where the DB breaks the wrong way. Hayden Hurst gets
wide open.
Big conversion where he's uncovered. And you have to bring more pressure. One of the things I always get a little bit, the Chiefs did a fantastic job of bringing pressure in this game in the right moments with the right players. We saw the Bengals hold up against the Bills in a way that nobody really expected, but not just that nobody expected them to hold up at all, but not only did they hold up well, they held up almost perfectly. This game, they had a lot more trouble, in part because Chris Jones you'd love to see him win Defensive Player of the Year after this game. One of the things with him is he's been so dominant in the regular season for the Chiefs. This year, his best season, but he finally comes through with big plays in the playoffs in this game. I did think that the Chiefs could have brought a little bit more pressure on some of the 3rd and longs. That's one of the things you just hate to do is see them drop into coverage. And because you then give so much time, you want the opposing team to throw underneath and then be able to rally from the tackle. Obviously, if you bring too many people, then you risk the throw over the top. But you prefer not to see that blown play at the end of the first half. Again, if you're a Chiefs fan, it's a great design by the Bengals, a good execution by Joe Burrow. So you can convert some of these 3rd and longs, but especially with as well as the Chiefs defense was playing and with the pressure that they were getting, as soon as you get that intentional grounding call at the end of the game, you do think that the Chiefs are going to get the stop. It's very unlikely that the Bengals convert. And that one is tricky. And I was watching with folks who are always rooting for more intentional grounding because they don't want the QBs to get away with these throws. And yet that one, even they were scratching their heads a little bit. Now, I do think it's probably the correct call and that P. Ryan had released down the field and the pass is basically spiked.
And it kind of hit I thought it could have been illegal touching maybe as well. Before the flag, I'll say from my perspective, before the flag even came out, in my head was like, that's either intentional grounding or illegal touching. Because I was like, where's his targeted receiver? He threw it at the feet of his lineman. There's 2 linemen there between him and P. Ryan. He's kind of throwing it in the direction of where P. Ryan is, but it's very clearly not intended for P. I thought it was a penalty right away.
So honestly. You like that call as well?
I thought that was the right call. I honestly did.
So there's some controversial plays in this game. There was some trouble with the play clock that let the Chiefs have extra plays. Still on balance, it seems like it was decided on the field by the teams here where the Chiefs get the stop after they punt. I mean, they they gave the Bengals the chance to win, and their defense held up.
It did. Yeah, I mean, so they get that conversion. You're talking about the 3rd and 16, a minute left. And it was bizarre from a defensive perspective on a 3rd and 16 to have a player wide open a couple yards beyond the sticks, right? Like an 18-yard pass, and then he's able to just turn and run 5 more yards and go out of bounds. But they get the stop right after that. They get another big 3rd down sack. Obviously, the sacks and the pressure, it became a big storyline here. And this is one of the reasons, I did pick Kansas City in this game over at stealing lines. One of the reasons was all the concerns about the Bengals offensive line going into the Bills game led to a 6-point spread in that game. They didn't come to pass in that game. And then suddenly it felt like everyone was like, oh, well, then I guess the offensive line's not an issue at all. Well, maybe the offensive line crops up here. And people talked about how the snow maybe impacted the Bills pass rush the week prior. The offensive line did crop up as an issue here. It's kind of the opinions of the Bengals swung and based on the market. And typically Vegas isn't really reactionary, but they swung a lot in this postseason. They struggle with, they're big favorites against the Ravens, who they have struggled with in the past, and they struggle with them. And so then they are huge underdogs going into Buffalo, and they're able to dominate that game. And then suddenly they were, favorites for a period versus the Chiefs. The line ends up swinging back onto KC's side at close. But big shifts in what you would say the Bengals team strength was relative to their Vegas lines and their market lines. And it was a lot of it was just like, this is variance. This is stuff that can happen. Like their offensive line held up against the Bills. It didn't really hold up against the Chiefs as well. And that was a big part of this. I mean, the intentional grounding was another play where the offensive line didn't necessarily hold up. There were sacks. There were non-sacks as well that the line was an issue. Burrow still plays a pretty good game. I mean, he has some interceptions, some issues, but they are able to be in position to win, which is, I think, needs to be said at least in somewhat favorably. Some of that was due to a couple of big plays, the big play to Chase on 4th down that you mentioned, the big touchdown to Higgins, which is just a really great throw and a really great catch. Burrow had a couple bad picks as well. So, I mean, he was good and bad, not perfect, tough offensive line game. They were in contention late. As you noted, it did feel like it ultimately came down to the players on the field for the most part, and it feels like the right team sort of won, but it took a lot to get there. And anyway, you were describing very well a lot of those things. We're bouncing around a lot, Shawn, in terms of all the things that we wanted to cover in this game, which is whatever. That's the way we like to do it. We like to have a little fun as we talk through the game and how we both saw it. But I kind of want to go all the way back to, we've talked about the punt stuff, but the first punt after that interception, I got a little sidetracked when I brought this up earlier, but they take over at the 39 after an interception with 2:30 to go in the first half. They're 40 yards away from the end zone. They throw 3 straight incompletions and punt 12 seconds later. And they're punting from the 39-yard line. We talked about how this led to a long drive for the Bengals. It's the last drive of the first half. The Bengals end up getting a field goal at the end. This decision to throw 3 straight downs, I'm almost never arguing for a running play. But I think there at the 39, you get a run play for 4 yards. It turns a 56-yard field goal into a 52-yard field goal in the cold weather. A lot more makeable potentially, right? The other thing it does, if you're able to run for 4 yards, and maybe they felt like they couldn't run for 4 yards, but at number one, it runs the clock down to the 2-minute warning so that the rest of your drive is on the other half of the 2-minute warning and ultimately maybe doesn't leave enough time for the Bengals on the way back. Number two, it creates a situation where you're now at 4th and 6 from the 35 as opposed to 4th and 10 from the 39 where they decided to punt. If you look at their decision later where they were 4th and 8 from the 37 and decided to punt, maybe this means they still would have punted. But in my head at the time, I'm thinking you run on an early down because then you can go for it on 4th if it's 4th and 6 or 4th and 8. If you're ultimately going to punt on 4th and 10 in this spot at this field position, don't you want to make it a little bit of a more manageable, as coaches like to think about it, down in distance on 3rd and 5, 4th and 5? I think I would have ran on 1st, and even if I got 2 yards, I would have ran on 2nd. And then I had a makeable 3rd and 5 or what have you. And the decision at that point to either kick a 50 to 52-yard field goal or go for it on a 4th and 5-ish. And that's in a situation where your run isn't really effective. But say you run on first down and run for 5 yards. Now you can throw 3 times like you did and try to go for it. I mean, I just don't understand, I guess, coming out in that field position at that clock when you have the opportunity to run down the 2-minute warning, like I said, and take more time off before you potentially give the ball back to the Bengals, and throwing 3 straight incompletions and then punting on 4th. If you're going to punt on 4th and 10, then put yourself in a situation where you can make a decision to kick a field goal or go for it on a 4th and shorter. Or if you're going to go for it on 4th and 5 or whatever, if you run on first down, you still can throw 3 times. You can have the same 3 passes that you had. It's like a free play to run the ball in my head. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but that sequence was so bizarre to me. After that interception with Burrow, that's the one you've referenced a couple times and said they had an opportunity to potentially put the game away. They're up 13-3 at that point, and they're getting the ball after the half. It was a huge possession for the Bengals before that when Burrow threw the interception. And now the Chiefs take over, and it's, hey, there's 2 minutes left. They're starting at their plus 40. If they can score again at 13-3 and then get ball to start the second half, this game can be over early in the third quarter. Instead, they wind up with this quick 3-and-out, this punt. Bengals get a field goal, and then they go 3-and-out to start the second half, and Bengals come down and score a touchdown, and it's 13-3 or 13-13 at that point. It's all of a sudden tied. You go from that interception that Burrow threw, and everyone knows is a huge possession before half, to somehow being tied early in the third quarter. It's just poor management all around. But I really wanted to isolate that 3 straight passes. I'm never advocating for run, Sean, but you got to run there, right?
I'm going to say no. The Chiefs handed the ball to Pacheco and Jarrett McKinnon 14 times in this game. They gained 27 yards. If anything, that overstates how successful they were running the ball. I had written about this game, and I think you and I talked about it a little bit, that they, in the previous games against Cincinnati, they'd run the ball actually fairly effectively for what the Chiefs usually do. And then I thought that might be by design really from the Bengals side, where you're trying to create a little bit of incentive for the Chiefs to go more run heavy than they should and take the ball out of Patrick Mahomes' hands. Maybe that's just making stuff up. In this game, with Mahomes clearly limited and the Chiefs pass catchers already by this time clearly limited, I think the Bengals are just like, we're going to stop the Chiefs on every possession and just get the ball back and go win the game. There's no reason we want to let them gain any yards rushing. Let's just stop them. And the Chiefs were having guys in the backfield. Pacheco and McKinnon are running the wrong way. It was a debacle every time they handed the ball off. And so I can understand why they didn't want to do it in that situation. Tactically, it would have made a lot of sense, I think, for like 31 other teams in the NFL. I mean, every team runs the ball better than the Chiefs. I mentioned in my article about this game and about this weekend that the Chiefs are number 2 in the NFL in percentage of times hit at the line of scrimmage. So the second fewest. Teams don't get their hands on these guys because they're playing pure pass defense.
Right.
And yet still the Chiefs are an ineffective running game because their backs are that bad. That played into this game, and that they just couldn't run the ball at all. So then you become one-dimensional with a quarterback who can't move. I thought once you get the interception, the Chiefs are going to be up 16-3 or 20-3 at halftime. They're going to get the ball to start the second half, and there's going to be so much pressure on the Bengals that the game is more or less over. That obviously isn't what happened. I also wanted to kind of note just one thing that maybe something that always stands out to me. Maybe there are some real football people out there who have a better handle on this, and it's just something weird that stands out to me. But you mentioned a couple of bad passes from Joe Burrow. The second interception I thought was a great play by the defense. This pass here was a missed pass, and either Burrow thought the receiver was going to go somewhere else, or he just made a terrible throw, because this was an easy pick to Jalen Watson. There actually was a similarly bad throw early in the game that was thrown directly to Trent McDuffie, the corner the Chiefs had traded up in the first round this year to go with. He dropped that pick, which would have also been very helpful for the Chiefs. But Watson picks this ball up. He has a little bit of a runway. Instead of cutting, and he does gain some yards after the pick, but instead of cutting back upfield and fighting for any additional yard, he kind of jogs out of bounds and celebrates. This is a huge play in the game. And you think about it like a punt return, or you think about it like a handoff to a running back. You think about some of the plays that Pacheco did make. because Pacheco did make some plays in the passing game that were impressive. And while I'm very willing to criticize him for his ability as a pure runner, which does seemingly stem back to college, the fight that he showed as a receiver, and once he got just so impressive. I was so proud of him, so happy for him. He was obviously
best
excited.
game for him all season. I thought he looked great on those plays too.
Yeah. So, I mean, you think about that fight. Once you pick that ball off, you've got to fight, because you mentioned like how silly it was. The Chiefs are passing right on this. You're right on the threshold of being able to score without the offense having to do anything. Yeah, you have Patrick Mahomes. Yeah, you just made an interception and changed the game. You've got to help your team. It's not over once you've made the pick. You gain an additional 5 yards on that return. It changes everything. And again, there's going to be a hindsight element to how badly the Chiefs needed it. But, I mean, you want to take every single – and one of the things that we have witnessed from the Patriots throughout this entire dynasty, and one of the reasons why, in some ways, they're just so – one of the reasons that the Patriots almost get to be, in addition to just how good they are, but sort of annoying for everyone, is this emphasis and demeanor on and insistence, even when it's not 100% true, but that all 11 players – play all out to the snap on every play, the entire game, and you never know when that tiny edge from some random player playing to the whistle is going to change the game. So Watson here, I also want to give credit for having played a pretty cool game for the Chiefs and stood up in a point where the Chiefs could have easily gotten shredded in this game. Then L'Jarius Sneed goes out on the first possession. You got rookie corners in there. One of the cool things, and we talk all the time about Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant, his story, a truth is stranger than fiction, or a story that no one would believe if, you put this into a movie. But the Chiefs here, they have Pacheco, who is one of the very final players drafted in the 2022 draft. He's pick 251. Jalen Watson, who makes this interception, he's in coverage on the play where T. Higgins goes over him to make the touchdown. So, he does get kind of posterized or what have you. But Jalen Wilson, pick 243. The Chiefs have 2 guys making huge plays in this game who are drafted at the end of the 7th round. So, I mean,
this year.
Right, this year. They're rookies. I love these guys. It's sort of nitpicky. I would have loved to see him gain it, because even as he ran out of bounds, I'm thinking to myself, that could be all the difference. I mean, there's no guarantee you pick up a single additional yard, and they did not.
Yeah, the other place where that came up this year that I recall was late in the year, the Seahawks-Rams game, it was in overtime. Baker Mayfield throws an interception. The Seahawks need to win this game. It's week 17. Or week 18. Was it the game that – yeah, it was week 18, the game that pushed them into the playoffs. And Quandre Diggs picks off a pass and just runs out of bounds. And I saw a lot of comments, and I felt at that time as well, he had a lot of room to run. He could have returned it for 40 yards. It's almost like the defenders are so focused on defense that as soon as they pick off the ball, it's I've done my job. The return isn't really even coached up or discussed, but it's massive. And on the Quandre Diggs play, it could have been 40 yards. On the Watson one, I don't really remember that play as specifically in the Chiefs game, but definitely take your word for it. That if I went back and looked at, I would see it the same way. And you're right. I mean, even if he only gets 5 more yards, if he's just trying to get a little bit more yardage, he gets 5 more yards, that solves the whole problem I was just saying about the field position, where you're right on that fringe of field goal range. You said you would have thrown in all 3 of those spots anyway. I assume you probably would have also gone for it on 4th, though, as opposed to punting from the 39-yard line. But if they were at the 34-yard line, it's a different conversation. I don't think you're punting from the 34, certainly. Probably can kick a field goal from there. That was sort of the whole point of why I would have justified running it, is you can potentially turn a punt into a field goal because you're so close to that fringe of field goal range. At any rate, yeah, that was a wild play. And you noted, we talked about all the Chiefs receiver injuries. You also noted L'Jarius Sneed. He played 4 snaps in this game. He's there, kind of the rock on their cornerback room, that their 3 highest snap cornerbacks in this game were all 2022 rookies. In addition to Pacheco and Watson, who were the 7th rounders who played a ton, you have Trent McDuffie, a 1st rounder. Joshua Williams as well plays 89% of the snaps as their 3rd cornerback. And he was a 4th rounder this year, all drafted in the 2022 draft. They've been playing him for a lot. of the season.
And Brian Cook's second round pick plays a lot as well at safety.
Yeah, I mean, just a young team, and they're forced into being a young team. This injury to L'Jarius Sneed, kind of maybe the biggest of all of the injuries. I mean, the Chiefs had the other wide receiver injuries, but that was a massive one. And for them to still be able to play, solid defense and not get completely shredded, like you said, is, a testament to how well they played, which, gets all the way back to you saying that they're going to get shredded by the Eagles. They have 2 weeks to get healthy now, Sean. You keep saying they're going to get shredded by all these teams. They keep winning even as they get injured and banged up. I think they're a little bit better than you, as a long-suffering Chiefs fan, want to admit. I kind of like the Chiefs early on to beat the Eagles in this Super Bowl, but we'll see how it goes. I think that's everything for this game that we wanted to discuss. We're getting close to the end of the show. We did want to talk a little bit about the Eagles-Niners game. There were the last thing in the KC game I actually wanted to get your thought on was the 5th down, or the third down that the Chiefs didn't convert. They ran their whole punt team on the field, and then the referees were like, oh, that play didn't even happen. And I mean, I was so glad they ended up having to punt on that series, and it didn't decide the game, because if the Chiefs go down and score there, I mean, can you imagine the conspiracy theories? But I guess that's the only thing I have to say about that, is that I'm just glad that it didn't decide the game, right?
Yeah, I am too. And this game just featured a lot of weird stuff. You do see Patrick Mahomes try and throw some of these screen passes when he doesn't have the ball completely in his hand. Hopefully that will no longer happen after he commits what, I mean, very likely should have been a season-ending turnover there. That's the other thing with him being limited, and he was extremely limited in this game. After he fumbled, he had no ability to go recover that ball.
Yeah.
And so, that part of it.
Clumsy. Yeah.
Just couldn't move. The only thing he could kind of do was run forward a little bit, which he did do on that very final play. And I think the Bengals weren't even expecting he could do that, because both the quarterbacks were having to throw balls away that in most parts of the season they would have extended the plays. On the Bengals side, because the Chiefs were getting such extreme pressure, Burrow took sacks early. Later in the game, he just spiked the ball to avoid the lost yards, but it still hurts you when you have those negative, or you have those zero gain plays. You're losing a down that is very important. Before we leave, you again, I mean, you had some harsh words for Andy Reid. They were definitely justified. I did want to point out that the Chiefs ran 2 hook and ladder plays in this game. And the play where the other play where they had a timeout, and you said you didn't need a timeout before the 4th and goal where they're just going to kick a field goal anyway. That one was also supposed to be Travis Kelce throwing the lateral. He looked over at where Noah Gray was and thought about what he had just done on the previous one. It's like, I'm going to go ahead and run forward here.
And he didn't do it. Yeah. No, that was fun. I completely agree. That was fun. They didn't work out, but I'm so glad they tried it. There was some speculation that maybe it had to do with his back, and they didn't want him to take hits, so they were setting up a lateral. And I was joking on Twitter. I was like, I hope they do this on every Travis Kelce catch, because I just want this to become a thing, like just accidentally, that now everyone starts to do, because it was so much fun. But yeah, on the Mahomes fumble and his injury, I mean, first of all, with the high ankle sprain thing, there was a bunch of people on Twitter. I saw some comments that were like, there's no way he has a high ankle sprain. This is being dramatized, basically. There's different severities of high ankle sprains. We've heard, I mean, anyway, he was clearly limited. I kind of reject that. I think he didn't have the severe one that can push you out for 4 to 6 weeks, and then you have some complications typically down the road as well. You can talk about breaks. Tony Pollard, unfortunately, had a broken bone with his more severe one. Mahomes, obviously not that severe, but still, I think, pretty clearly not just your standard low ankle sprain, what have you. He was obviously not healthy. I mean, there was the one where he had to turn and pivot and throw, and Romo pointed out that all of his weight rolling to his left was on that foot, and how much pain that caused. And he's obviously also on painkillers and things, but it still was limiting him. But on that fumble, I mean, Sean, there's all these discussions of like, well, if Patrick Mahomes would have done that, the internet would have stopped when other quarterbacks do something interesting. And then there are the people that I tend to be in their bucket with who say, actually the reality is Patrick Mahomes does like 3 or 4 things a game that if any other quarterback did, we would go nuts about. But it's become so commonplace that we don't actually celebrate him as much as we possibly could. This is a play, though, Sean. If Kirk Cousins did that, I would have laughed at him for months. I would have still been laughing at him years from now. So it is fair to say that because it was Patrick Mahomes, I'm just like baffled and not sure what happened on the fumble. But if it was one of the dorkier QBs, if Daniel Jones would have done this, I'm sorry, it would have been a different reaction for me. And
well, there was no point at which he had the ball, right? So it's not like he has the ball and it slips out of his hands. He tries to make a throw in which he's not holding the ball in his fingers.
Right. And it looks, on the slow-mo, it looks really dumb. And him trying to recover the fumble looks really dumb. Just a baffling play, honestly. Like, you get it. He was trying to throw too quick, but like, you got to be more careful than that. You can't let that happen in that spot. You're winning by 7 in the AFC Championship. There's a minute left in the third quarter. You can't do that, period. There's just no... Wow. That was one of the most unexpected moments of the NFL season for me. I was just like, what just happened? That was wild. But, Sean, the Niners... Eagles game we haven't talked about a ton. The Eagles look great again. The Eagles are a very good team. I'm not trying to discredit that when I talk about liking the Chiefs early on at this stage. The Eagles, I think you made a really good point earlier that I agree with, did not look as good as winning an AFC Championship 31-7 would suggest. I don't think Jalen Hurts looked as good. You get obviously a weird game where 2 quarterbacks get hurt and you're down to Brock Purdy coming back in, but I think only throwing 2 passes after that point. He ended up with 4 pass attempts for the entire game. Clearly just couldn't throw, and they more or less threw the towel in. I would have liked to see them do something else, whatever that was. Play McCaffrey at quarterback. Play Jawan Jennings, who has a quarterback background. Do something else because Brock Purdy throws, like I said, 4 passes in the entire game, plays most of the second half in relief of Josh Johnson, who obviously was in relief of him. And it seems like he has like a significant UCL injury. So the big discussion there is this rule that used to exist about the third quarterback, which there used to be a rule where every team had a third quarterback that was active as the emergency quarterback. But the second he entered the game, the other 2 quarterbacks were inactive. So they had to have essentially both been injured and knocked out of the game. Or it would, if the team decided to burn that third QB, they were deactivating their other 2 QBs. There was no other way to use that roster spot to manipulate the system. The NFL eventually decided to remove those stipulations and just make that an extra roster spot. And head coaches have now decided, basically, we're not going to carry a third QB. We're going to use that extra roster spot for another linebacker, another receiver, what have you. And you understand why when you see what the Chiefs went through at wide receiver in this game, right? Like, they needed all the receivers they could get. They were down to their final 3 at the end of the game. Having said that, I don't understand. I mean, it's too easy for 2 quarterbacks to get hurt in the same game. It's very possible, particularly as we are more concerned about player health and safety, as we should be. Josh Johnson ends up getting a concussion here. We've seen a lot of quarterbacks have their head slammed down. Similarly, obviously, Tua is the best example from this season. That happened multiple times. It's the freshest example on everybody's mind, I should say. But there are many quarterbacks who can obviously get concussions. We don't want to create any rules or stipulations that minimize the potential for us to actually do what the NFL is trying to do, which is get these players off the field and get checked out when they might have a concussion. It might have been the case that Josh Johnson passed the concussion protocol and was good to go. But the second they had to remove him after Purdy had already been hurt in this game, there was sort of a disaster. They didn't know what to do. They put Purdy back in. Purdy, they're doing an MRI on, might have a torn UCL for all we know, but he ends up having to come back in and play the rest of that game because their only alternative is playing, Christian McCaffrey or what have you. So kind of a ridiculous situation for the NFL, in my opinion, in the NFC Championship, where it's just possible for 2 quarterbacks to get hurt in the same game. They have the ball in their hand every single play. They get hit a lot. We're trying to protect them as much as we can, but defenses are trying to get to them every single play and hit them. It's not like any other position. I mean, they have the ball every single play. They're the only position that does. For you to be in and then the second side of that is it's the most important position on the NFL field. If the team has 2 injured quarterbacks and no third quarterback, they can't do anything. We just watched this, right? They tried to run the ball. They tried to be creative with Christian McCaffrey, with Deebo Samuel, do different things. The Eagles were able to clamp down defensively, move up, not have to defend deep. Brock Purdy clearly couldn't throw down the field, and the Niners couldn't score another point. I mean, they were not going to get anywhere without a threat to throw down the field. You have to have that on an NFL field. I don't know. I just think that was a pretty big storyline that maybe won't go discussed as much as it should. I think that needs to be a rule change. If they wanted to add that extra roster spot for other players, that's fine. I think there still needs to be an emergency third quarterback in some fashion because the position is too important. You can't have this, right? I mean, what was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, I'd like to have the emergency quarterback as well. There are scenarios in which teams are prepared, perhaps because of quarterback injuries that have already taken place. And maybe you're concerned that your starter has an issue and you're preparing for it a little bit. But you want to see as high quality of football as possible. You want the players to be protected as much as possible. One of the things here, you think back to it, it's not just that this turned the game into something of a travesty in the second half, but probably if the 49ers had to do it again, especially after you realized that nothing you did worked, you weren't going to win the game anyway, but maybe you could have been more competitive if you had gone with Jennings, as you mentioned, for an example. But once you have time to let everything cool down and think about it, you realize how you just don't know what's happening there with Purdy. I don't know. I mean, I've seen some things suggesting that maybe he was going to be the guy for them next year and that Trey Lance would be traded. I kind of assumed, I guess, that Trey Lance still just gives them so much more ceiling, that he's still the long-term option for them. But either way, you may have taken someone, or you could maybe contribute to the odds of a young player who has now a bright future in the league, really setting back his entire career by having him go out and have to be on the field at all in this circumstance. Yeah, it just very unfortunate what happened. The other thing with it, in addition to player safety and creating high quality games, and the NFL has a little bit of a problem with its product. The playoffs have been exciting in terms of the storylines, the teams that were going to face each other. The play has actually not been that great. Even in the Chiefs-Bengals game, there are some issues with quality of play where a different kind of shootout would have been preferable maybe to a lot of viewers. You can't afford to have these games as the NFL that go from being your spotlight for the entire sport to being something that everyone flips away from. If you don't have, fantasy things on the line, people flip away from at halftime. I mean, that's horrible for the NFL. But you think about even some very small, like downriver effects, in that the more teams who are giving more reps and trying to get more QBs ready, it probably is good for the NFL. When you have stories like a Geno Smith who emerges down the road, a Ryan Fitzpatrick, you have some of these guys like a Tony Romo, who perhaps he's always going to be able to get his opportunity. But when you look at the quarterback play, even for a lot of teams at the starting position, and then definitely you look at the backup play and how that destroys teams. You think about what happened, with the Dolphins once Tua is out. Anything that you can do structurally to get more QBs ready and to give more, for example, this season, if the injuries don't happen the way they do, we probably never learn that Brock Purdy is a potential starting NFL quarterback. You just want to do as many things as you can to get as many quarterbacks chances and get them prepared as you can do. And any rule that you make that helps teams carry more quarterbacks, because as you pointed out, anytime that you have a rule that says, well, now you've got an extra roster spot, but you don't have to use it for a quarterback, well, then you can't, because you can't prepare for this little tiny outcome when using that roster spot on a different position gives you so much value for the vast majority of the outcomes. So it makes sense to have a dedicated emergency quarterback.
Most of the last roster spots are players that are going to play on special teams. You have the Taysom Hill type player. I mean, it's one of the things that the Saints love about having Taysom Hill so much is he is a last roster spot, but also plays special teams, right? But he can also be your emergency quarterback. They carry 3 quarterbacks, but they still get special teams usage out of that. To field a full 11 offense, a full 11 defense, and a full 11 special teams, and the different special teams units that you have, from the kicking game to the return game, what have you, is a lot of the players on a roster already that need to be accounted for. So that's a big part of this. And yeah, I mean, if they added another roster spot and didn't clarify that it had to be a QB, NFL coaches would probably say, look, I can get another special teams / backup linebacker into my, plans. And that's probably what they would do. It does need to be a clear quarterback stipulation. And Shawn, we were talking a little bit about it. I think the rule that used to exist where if the third QB comes in, both of the other 2 are immediately ruled inactive is a little bit like too harsh and kind of silly, because again, you get to the situation where in this Niners game, Josh Johnson, what if he ends up getting cleared from his concussion? You want to make it so that he has time to go get checked out properly. But then also, if he's clear, that he's able to come back into the game. One of the things we talked about as we were spitballing before the show is maybe they should just make it so that one quarterback is declared inactive. You can't bring in that third quarterback and still have both the other quarterbacks active. That would still make it so that you couldn't just use Taysom Hill, for example, as your emergency third and then bring him in the first quarter, because you would have to immediately declare some other quarterback inactive, and then you'd only have 2 quarterbacks. It would defeat the purpose, right? So there's other ways they could structure this that they have not, but they should. The last thing, Shawn, I mean, the Eagles go on, they win this game convincingly. There's going to be a lot of discussion, I think, over the next couple of weeks about how they had one of the easiest schedules in the regular season, and then they beat the Giants and Daniel Jones, and then they win this game in the fashion that we just described, where the 49ers, in some ways, didn't really have a chance. And again, I was on the Eagles. I bet the Eagles. I was rooting for the Eagles. I'm not trying to discredit their win, but it has to be said that the 49ers didn't really get to employ whatever offensive game plan they had in this game really at all. There will be discussion about the Eagles, strength of team and all that. They are a very good team. It'll be fun to break that down as we go. The last thing I want to talk about, though, is refereeing generally. And the further we get along in a world where there's more gambling and there's more cameras and there's more focus, it's been happening over a decade plus, but the spotlight on the NFL referees is there, and it's been there. And I talk about this on Twitter from time to time. I often get the replies like, oh, you remember when we had the referee lockout and we had the backup referees and how bad they were? And I get it. It's not an easy sport to referee. At the same time, that is an excuse we continue to make. But I do think there's still room for us to say that, look, this is something the NFL has to address. They're not very good. The referees are not very good, even if we give them some leniency. It's a problem for me that I can watch from my living room the few camera angles we get and see things that they can't. That's an issue. That shouldn't happen. They are NFL referees. They should be the best at their jobs of anyone. It's the same as the actual players, that these players are so. There's people that go, oh, I could go play quarterback for the 49ers. No, you couldn't. You don't understand how much more challenging it is to play at that level. There's only a few people who believe that. Most rational thinking people and reasonable people that aren't delusional understand they couldn't do the job of NFL players. It's incredibly difficult to do. The same is true probably of NFL referees. Just because you refereed some game at some small peewee level or something doesn't mean you can be an NFL referee. I'm not trying to suggest that I can. Having said that, I expect them to be as good at their job as I expect the NFL players to be at their job, right? We can still criticize them. And the NFL's created a system where the referees more or less don't have any accountability. They don't fire them. They are sort of appointed for life, but they're also not full-time employees because they don't want to pay them. They all have very lucrative other jobs. Many of them are lawyers, or that's been said before. It helps them understand the depth of the NFL rule book, yada, yada, yada. The NFL could hire full-time referees. They could train them better. They could make it more accountable, where if you're not very good at your job, you will get replaced. I understand that even in college football, the refereeing is not perfect. There are other things they could do as well, though, with the Sky Cam, the ways they use reviews, a lot of those things. It is a problem, even though we need to give some leniency, that we're at the biggest stages like this, and we're having the same conversation, because in this game, the referees missed the Devonta Smith catch. The Eye in the Sky missed it as well. The way that we facilitate that, missed that. It also missed the Brock Purdy injury play was a fumble, was ruled an incomplete pass and blown dead. Immediately when that ball fluttered in the air, I was like, there's no way from a physics perspective he was throwing that. And they teach them, don't blow your whistle if it's at all uncertain. Let the play out. I don't think that guy was going to return it for a touchdown, but there was potential there. The Eagles player did get a clear recovery, but he was trying to run and it got blown dead. It ends up being called a fumble and a turnover, but we don't get that officiated correctly in real time, which has happened a number of times this year and cost teams games where they're blowing plays that they're not supposed to be blowing. It's a lot of the same mistakes. We saw more mistakes, I think, in the Kansas City-Cincinnati game. It overshadowed both games, in my opinion, in a way that I do understand the referees are humans, and we do have to be able to accept some degree of errors and mistakes along the way. I think the NFL has to do better as well. We still should expect more. And it's more of an issue in the sense of, again, a lot of money on it. NFL playoffs are hugely watched, hugely popular. The Super Bowl, hugely popular. Referees are going to have a microscope on all of their moves. And again, I don't think we should expect perfection. But it's in the NFL's best interest, frankly, if they would just get this stuff figured out and straightened out so that it was better. I do think better is doable. I don't think it's, you know what I mean? I don't think it's impossible. I don't know. Just something I wanted to say. I think it was a big takeaway from yesterday. I don't buy into any of the conspiracy theories. I think it's mostly just incompetence with a lot of this stuff. And I do think it is difficult, and you can't expect perfection. But, man, they're on the field. There are some referees that are really good, that make some really good calls. And we see the replays, and I'm like, oh, that wasn't pass interference. I see the replay. I was like, oh, I see it now. Good call. Like, he put himself in the right position. He made the right call. There are absolutely good referees, and there are good calls that are made, better calls than I would expect someone off the street to be able to make every week. It's some of the mistakes the referees make are, if you watch as much football as you and I do, Sean, they are so simple. It's just, I don't know. There's nuance here, and I feel like we let them off the hook too quick because everyone wants to say they're human beings and everything, but like it has to be better. The NFL is creating an issue for its own product when the conference championship games have this much referee talk.
It's not ideal, and the issue around the betting and all of that does add a layer that is even vaguely sinister. You don't want any of that to come into play at any point. I like the fact that some of the video stuff and the officiating sort of off the field, being able to help the guys who are on the field, you like to see that. And there have been some mild evolutions there where the officials on the field are getting some information from New York, what have you, that helps them move through some of the elements more quickly, get some things right. It would be nice if that could be incorporated in a way that remains fairly seamless and moves the game along as opposed to slows it down. Again, you want to get the correct calls. It would be nice if replay could be incorporated into some of the player safety elements in a way that made the players actually safer. You and I have talked about how making some of these plays reviewable might actually let some people off the hook in terms of dangerous plays, that because of technicalities, maybe you end up not actually making the player safe. But I think you can do a variety of things there, and maybe you structure it slightly differently. So you have different responsibilities on the field. Officiating isn't an area where you would want to skimp in resources, whether those are human or financial or what have you, because it does need to be right. Even things that maybe don't matter that much and maybe are technically correct. The thing you don't really want is to have it feel arbitrary to the fans. You think about the Pacheco touchdown run, and they go back and look at that, and obviously the offensive lineman who's called begs to differ. As a Chiefs fan, I know that I'm biased. Maybe it's a hold, but you're like, that if it's the kind of play that happens pretty consistently, like how often are we calling that a hold? When it happens on a huge leverage play, it feels like it's something that definitely has to be right, as opposed to a borderline type of call. Obviously, you're going to get plenty of those from the Bengals side where they're like, there are some clear-cut plays. It's also a problem, as we discussed throughout the year, in terms of trying to figure out how you fix some of these things, though, is hard because even reviews where they're not calls in the moment, where you have these players operating at a speed that's hard to fathom, and how could you possibly see it and get the calls correct? When they're slowing the plays down and looking at them frame by frame, they'll come back with calls that half the people are like, number one, what are actually the rules? Because we feel like this was adjudicated differently in the very last game. And then number two, what are the standards? Because half the people looking at this don't see what the officials just did when they had time. So I think that part of my point there is just that I do think it's extraordinarily difficult, but they do need to get to the place where there are fewer mistakes and there's more consistency. That's so necessary, just number one, for the product to be good, and then number two, to eliminate any kind of concerns that outside influences would be involved in any of this.
Right. And then as you were saying that, something that kind of crystallized for me that's a frustration is the way that they decide these things. You're talking about maybe they could position the referees differently. Maybe they could change the way, some of the rules. You don't want it to feel arbitrary. You said where we are with the NFL rulebook right now, and part of the reason there's so much frustration is everything has been reactionary for like a decade or more, where something comes up that I think in a lot of the cases was foreseeable, and then they respond and they change something. There was the obvious one with the making defensive pass interference reviewable after the play with the Rams and the Saints in the playoffs that cost the Saints a playoff game. I believe it was the Rams and Saints. They made it reviewable for a year, but they structured that in a way where the referees had so much power in that, and they pretty clearly, if you go back and look at the way that went down, tried to make the review process of the pass interference seem so hard to do that no one, it was a 1-year trial period, and it was almost structured from the referee's side to turn public perception against the idea that we can't have pass interference be reviewable. It's too subjective. It's too hard to do. We're still getting them wrong. And it was annoying fans, and people were outspoken. And so the NFL just said, okay, well, we're not going to keep doing that. We did it for 1 year. We're going to stop doing it. We're going to move on. Everything is reactionary to what in my opinion, worst football fans want. The ones that are just constantly throwing a fit about things that they don't really understand about the game, in my opinion. Again, call me an idiot if you want. I don't care. But it's all reactionary as opposed to being proactive. You are the experts. You run this league. Make rules and make refereeing in the way that you do it that are best for your product. People might gripe and not like some of it, but stick with it and then deal with that, and that you'll be in a better position. They have done that on some stuff. They've done that on some of the roughing the passer stuff, for example, the player safety stuff. Even I think they've done it poorly still. I think the body weight rule is inconsistently applied and everything, but that's one that NFL fans have been mad about, and they've stuck by it, and they've continued to try to protect their quarterbacks, which I think is the right long-term decision. You want to protect the most important players on the field, no matter what, no matter how many people say that we're soft for wanting that. It's the right thing for
Well,
your
and you think
product.
about player safety and how gentle the Chiefs were in taking down Joe Burrow in this game. Maybe a lot of people don't want to see that, and you could have gotten a roughing the passer at some point because of a random way a player moves at the last second. But he was dropped on the ground pretty gently on a lot of plays, and that's actually what the NFL does want, and is going to keep guys like Joe Burrow healthier for a long period of time. Which
is fine. It's a sport. Do we really need to see guys break their legs? What is this? This isn't Gladiator in ancient Rome. I'm okay with that. The guy won on his rep as a defensive lineman. He beat his offensive lineman. He still had to be really physical through a guy who's incredibly strong, trying to block him. He gets to Burrow, and he bear hugs him. I don't need to see him slam him on his head and see another concussion. Like, what are you as a fan? That doesn't make me soft. I'm sorry. I'm so frustrated by the tweets and the responses that, like, that's not what you want to see. You don't want to see Joe Burrow get hurt. Did you enjoy watching the Eagles 49ers game? No one enjoyed that. That was horrible. That was not an entertainment. That's what the people that want quarterbacks to get absolutely destroyed on every single play are rooting for. It's a situation where we have a quarterback out there who can't throw more than 5 yards. His backup quarterback already had a concussion. And to be clear, I don't think the Eagles did anything malicious. They can still get injured on normal plays. That's the point. That's why we should try to.
But you do have some officiating issues even at the end there with the help from the booth and what have you, where, I mean, what are the Eagles doing starting this brawl at the end of a game they're way ahead of? They don't catch the instigator. You know, you got blocked by Brandon Ayuk. Let it go. The game is over. You don't have to fight because you got blocked by Brandon Ayuk.
Trent Williams was trying to de-escalate. I saw that mentioned by like one person on Twitter and several others that were like, what is Trent Williams doing? He was trying to break it up. And then finally, he throws the guy to the ground.
He's like, stop face masking Debo. We're down by 24 points. Let it go.
The guy he ends up throwing out of there needed to just back off. He was an Eagles player that didn't, refuse. Anyway, we're off on a little bit of a tangent, but my argument remains that the NFL
is why you listen to the 123 mark.
That's true. My argument remains that the NFL has to make rules that are the smartest rules and put them in place and stick by them and let there be griping and not be reactionary to what, get a small subset of, the right types of people in place. Shawn, maybe me and you can just make the rules. I don't know, but get people that understand the game in place to make the rules and then stick with that. Don't just be reactionary to what, Joe Sixpack thinks about every single play. I mean, that's the stuff that is so frustrating. And they've done this over 10 years. And my point is 10 plus years. We're now at a place where, because they've done all these reactionary things and created all these rules as reaction to something that happened the prior season, everyone is constantly complaining about that. They're constantly complaining about the catch rule still. Catch rule has been modified every, other year because of a play that happened. And it's just a challenging rule to get right. But it was always clear when they made the first couple rules that, like, stuff like what used to happen to Calvin Johnson, or happened to him most notably a couple of times with the surviving the ground thing. Those plays were ruled correctly. And then no one liked it. And that was going to be clear from the moment you put that rule into place. But you put that rule in place to try to appease people as opposed to think about what's best long-term. And then you're constantly adjusting and adjusting and adjusting. I think we're finally to a place with the catch rule where, like, it's getting a little bit better. But everything was adjustments for years.
So you're telling me Devontae Smith made the catch?
He did not. But that leads to fans being madder. Fans don't know what they want, is my point. They get mad, they demand things, changes happen, and then they get mad about those changes. They don't see the second order effects of all these changes. The NFL needs to get their crap together and make decisions that will be best long-term, take the heat in the front end, as opposed to constantly trying to be reactionary to fix the latest controversy in the next season's rules, and then creating a spiraling effect of more controversies, which they've done for like 10 years. It's a massive problem. The whole thing right now is we need less reviews because of the way that they did the defensive pass interference review stuff so poorly over that one season. And like, no, you just did it poorly. We need more reviews. We need to get the calls right. Like the quick automated reviews this year have been the best thing that the NFL has added. We need more of that. We need more of like, oh yeah, that ball wasn't caught. We're going to fix it on the field. No one needs to challenge. Let's move on. Like, let's just do it quick and get it right. I know that's not easy. It's not going to be perfect every single time. In situations like the Devonta Smith one, the Eagles are going to hurry up to the line and try to run their next snap because they don't want anyone to find out that ball hit the ground. There's still ways to do this, Shawn, and it's got to be handled better. There's probably stuff they have to handle with their partners and the ways that, like, they go to commercial break the second there's any type of review, even if it's a really quick review that, like, they didn't need to go to such a long commercial break for. There's probably stuff that needs to be worked out on that end where it's like, we're going to get back to the action as quick as the review allows us to, as opposed to like, oh, we're going to go to a 5-minute commercial break. Then everyone gets mad at the fact that there was a review because why did we have to go to a 5-minute commercial break? I'm sorry. I just had to get this off.
show some commercials in the corner of the screen throughout the game.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Or just, don't tie it to the review process, because that's going to turn public perception against the review process. Is sort of my point, I guess. Like, we're already all familiar with commercials at quarter breaks and after touchdowns. Like, just stick to that. You don't need to jam commercials into the review process. And then, I don't know. It is what it is. Obviously, there's money to be made there. I probably don't understand the economics of that, but I had to get this off my chest. It was one of the most frustrating things of the day yesterday. There were a lot of bad calls. Bad calls are going to happen, but the NFL's got to do a better job, man. They're doing it every season, every year. We get this in the playoffs. We just talked about the Saints game. Last year with the Bills-Chiefs, there was a reactionary rule change to the touchdown in overtime. Now there's different overtime rules. You go back several years and you have the first overtime rule change with the field goal was the Vikings-Saints playoff game. The Saints were on the positive side of that one. Ended up going down in history as the Bounty Gate game as well. You have, again, the Saints being on the negative side of the pass interference one. It's like every other year over the last 10 years where a team's season has ended because of something that the NFL then changed a rule about the next year because they weren't proactive in creating good rules beforehand. And I can't keep doing this as an NFL fan is where I'm going with this is I'm not saying that happened this weekend. I think the Bengals got the unfortunate side of the referee situation, absolutely, but also that the Chiefs probably deserve to win. Although, how much you weigh in Andy Reid's impact on that and the fact that the Bengals still could have won this game if they got some of the calls their way. The Niners, I don't think were completely only screwed by not having a third quarterback. They probably would have lost regardless. But, your product can't be about the rules all the time. So just get them right in advance. Be proactive.
I think we can kill two birds with one stone by having overtime required to be contested by the emergency quarterbacks. But the other question I wanted to ask you is, has there been a groundswell out there for you and me to make the rules?
I've not heard anything to that extent, but I just went on a 30-minute rant when we should have just ended this show. Maybe Colm, our lovely editor, will just take this off the end of the show so things can be a little bit tidier. But I had to get that off my chest, Shawn. The refereeing situation with the NFL, they got to make decisions and take criticism and do what they think is best for their product. Maybe that's the wrong thing. Maybe they don't know what's best for their product because they'll probably make bad decisions as far as that's concerned. Then they need to get different people in place to make the right decisions because it's nonsense.
So there we go. We have Chiefs, Eagles in the Super Bowl. I almost said Bengals. I guess, as a Chiefs fan, can't believe that they made it through. I think the Super Bowl is going to be absolutely fantastic. It's going to have limited nonsense. Then you and I will be here throughout doing reality, but also lots of fantasy work. You have a great article up at Stealing Signals talking about early ADP. Teams are already being drafted. You and I will get in there, draft some teams. You're not going to do some dynasty. The regular season, and by regular, I mean the actual NFL season, is about to end. But a lot of the most beautiful things in fantasy are just about to start. So we'll be there with you, Stealing Bananas. That'll do it for today's episode. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch. Sign up for Stealing Signals. Sign up for Stealing Lines. You will not regret it. Ben, people can also join us over at RotoViz if they would so desire. I was kind of blown away by how closely some of the things in the tools that I wrote about last Friday, Saturday actually came into play in the conference championship games. That part of it was fun. You and I had some pretty fun teams that we built in the FFPC playoff tournament that were one play away from winning hundreds of thousands of dollars. We won't go into depth with that because there's nothing more boring than someone else's fantasy team, but we have had fun. We love the FFPC. We love Underdog. Leave us a rating and review. If you have Apple, that helps us. Leave some comments on the YouTube. That's a great place to get your rule suggestions in there. maybe what it is, the Stealing Bananas community will rewrite the NFL rules for next season. That'll do it for us today. We'll talk to you guys soon.